Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something super interesting, the Israeli tour guide exam. You know you're prepping for that exam, and wow, it's going to be a lot, right? So much information coming at you. You've got historical dates, Zionist narratives, archaeological stuff.
It's a lot to take in.
For sure. I mean, just trying to reconcile all of that, right? You've got centuries of history with all sorts of different modern perspectives on it.
Right. It's almost like if you can imagine like stepping into a time machine and you've got these 19th century German anthropological views of the region, and those are like colliding head on with these modern Israeli narratives.
Whoa, a time machine. Okay, I like that. That's a really interesting way to think about it. I mean, so can you give me a concrete example? How do those viewpoints clash in practice?
Yeah, so, the traditional German approach might focus really heavily on like the region's geology, like in the notes where it talks about limestone and granite. It's almost as if understanding the physical land is like the key to understanding its history. But then a modern Israeli narrative might emphasize more of like the human element. The pioneers who settled the land, their struggles, their triumphs, and how they really shaped the Israel that we know today.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's like one is kind of purely academic and the other is more about this personal lived experience.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've got all of these different lenses, these different ways of looking at and interpreting history. Where does that leave you, right? I mean, as someone who is preparing for this exam, it's got to be overwhelming. How do you even make sense of it all?
Well, the notes have a really great suggestion, and that's to start with the exam itself. Instead of like getting caught up in the weeds of all these different perspectives, just focus on what you're going to be tested on.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's almost like you're using the exam as a roadmap to navigate all of this information.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. I remember when I was studying for the bar exam, I was just overwhelmed, with so much legal jargon. But focusing on past exams really helped me zero in on what was most important.
Right. You're not just passively absorbing information. You're really strategically targeting your learning based on what's actually going to be on the test.
So how does that work in practice? Do the notes give any tips on how to use past exams to prepare?
They do. And this is where it gets really fascinating. They talk about like analyzing past exams to really try and uncover the key themes and also all of those tiny little details, those needles in the haystack that examiners love to throw in there.
Oh, I like that. Needles in the haystack. So what kind of needles should our listener be on the lookout for?
Well, think about things like specific dates, names of maybe more obscure settlements, even architectural features of a Crusader fortress. Those kinds of things that maybe seem insignificant, but on the exam, they could really make all the difference because they're testing your deep knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so it's like a treasure hunt for those tiny details that might hold the key to passing the exam. But with all this focus on specific facts, how do you make sure you're not missing the big picture?
Well, that's where the actual tours come in. They become an invaluable tool because you can actually see the places and the stories that are part of the exam. You can bring those dry facts and figures to life.
Okay, so it's not just about memorizing dates and names, it's actually about experiencing these things.
Right. And as you're going on these tours, try to connect what you're seeing and hearing to potential exam topics.
Okay, so every site you visit, every story you hear, it can become a potential study session.
Exactly. And the notes actually give a good example of this. They talk about a tour of Benias, which is this site with tons of religious significance for lots of different faiths. And they talk about how the guide points out this key element. Then they talk about the Christian history and even read from the Bible. And then they transition into talking about the site's Islamic history. They show these niches and tell this story about Agrippa's floating restaurant.
Wow, it sounds like a whirlwind of information.
Yeah, but it's really cool because you see how all of these different pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Yeah, and it's cool to think about how paying attention to those details, the key, the niches, that story about the restaurant that can help you solidify those needles in the haystack for the exam.
It's all connected. And remember, this is just one step in the journey. Once you get your license now, you can take all of this knowledge and turn it into a compelling story that you can share with your audience.
Right, so you're not just a tour guide, you're like a storyteller bringing history to life. And speaking of captivating audiences, something in the notes really caught my eye, the fact that some of these historically significant sites are now incorporating technology, almost like a technological Disney World. What did you make of that?
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, you want to make these sites accessible and engaging, especially for younger people. But at the same time, you have to be careful not to overshadow the authenticity of the place.
Yeah, you don't want to lose that historical weight. It's a delicate balance. I remember visiting the Colosseum in Rome a few years ago, and they had these holograms of gladiators fighting, and it was cool, but it was almost too much.
Yeah, I can see that. You don't want to turn a place like Masada into a theme park, but you do want people to be able to connect with this story.
Right. It's
Uh,
something to think about. So we've talked about a lot of big picture ideas, but let's go back to those needles in the haystack, those little details that can make or break you on the exam. What are some specific examples from the notes that our listeners should be paying attention to?
Well, the notes mention Druze settlements around the Golan Heights.
Mm.
Understanding their history and culture, that could definitely pop up on the exam.
Yeah.
Also, the specifics of Medalla. It's this site that has really deep ties to early Christianity.
Right. Those are the kinds of things that might not seem crucial at first glance, but they could really be the difference between passing and failing.
Right.
And remember, tour guides often know what's likely to be on the exam, so pay attention to those asides and those random bits of information that they might throw in.
Yeah, those little clues can be really helpful.
So it's like you're on this quest for knowledge. You're piecing together this puzzle of Israeli history and culture. You're navigating all these different perspectives, and you're keeping an eye out for those tiny details. It's a lot.
It is. It's a challenging process.
Hmm.
But remember, it's temporary, and the reward is huge. You get to become a knowledgeable and confident tour guide, ready to share your own unique passion for this incredible land.
And that brings us back to what we talked about earlier. You can use the exam as a roadmap. You focus your energy, you study strategically, and ultimately you achieve your goal of becoming a certified tour guide.
And speaking of achieving goals, I think it's time to talk about visualizing success. The notes have some really interesting advice about that.
Ooh, visualization techniques. Those were a game changer for me when I was training for a marathon. Just picturing myself crossing the finish line helped so much. How did the notes suggest using this for the tour guide exam?
Well, they recommend picturing yourself, not just passing the exam, but actually leading a tour.
Hmm.
Imagine yourself standing at a historical site and effortlessly explaining things to a group of eager visitors.
Yeah.
Weaving together those historical facts, religious perspectives, personal anecdotes.
Wow, I love that. It's not just about acing the test, it's about feeling the confidence and excitement that comes with being a tour guide.
Exactly. And by doing that, you're not just preparing for the exam, you're preparing for the amazing journey that comes afterwards.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From clashing historical perspectives to visualization techniques, we've really explored the ins and outs of preparing for the Israeli tour guide exam.
And now we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the challenges and rewards of actually being an Israeli tour guide. So stay with us.
Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about how some historically significant sites are incorporating technology now, almost like a technological Disney World.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think on the one hand, you obviously want to make these sites accessible and engaging, especially for younger generations. But on the other hand, you don't want to overshadow the authenticity and historical weight of these places with flashy technology.
It's about finding that balance, right, between preserving the history, but also making it interesting and engaging for visitors.
Exactly. You don't want to turn a place like Masada into a theme park.
Right, but you also want people to be able to connect with the story, right?
Yeah.
Food for thought. So we've talked about a lot of big picture ideas, but let's go back to those needles in the haystack, those little details that can make or break you on the exam. What are some specific examples from the notes that our listeners should be paying attention to?
Well, the notes mention Druze settlements around the Golan Heights. Understanding their history and cultural significance could definitely pop up on the exam. Also, the specifics of Magdala, a site with deep ties to early Christianity, are worth a closer look.
Right. Those are the kinds of things that might not seem crucial at first glance, but, could easily be the difference between passing and failing.
Yeah.
And remember, tour guides often know what's likely to be on the exam, so pay attention to those little asides, those seemingly random bits of information they might throw in. They might be giving you valuable clues.
Exactly. It's like they're handing you pieces of a puzzle, and you have to figure out how to put them all together.
So our listener is on this quest for knowledge, piecing together the puzzle of Israeli history and culture, all while navigating these different perspectives and keeping an eye out for those elusive exam details. It's a lot to juggle.
It is, but remember, this challenging process is temporary. The reward is becoming a knowledgeable and confident tour guide, ready to share your own unique passion for this incredible land with the world.
And that brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, using the exam as a roadmap. It's about focusing your energy, studying strategically, and ultimately achieving your goal of becoming a certified tour guide.
And speaking of achieving goals, I think it's time we shifted our focus to the note's final piece of advice, visualizing success.
Oh, visualization techniques. Those were a game changer when I was training for a marathon. Picturing myself crossing the finish line helped me stay motivated during those tough training runs. How do the notes suggest applying this to the tour guide exam?
They recommend something really interesting. They suggest you imagine yourself not just passing the exam, but actually leading a tour, confidently sharing your knowledge with a group of eager visitors. Picture yourself standing at a historical site, effortlessly weaving together historical facts, religious perspectives, and personal anecdotes.
That's a powerful image. It's not just about acing the test, it's about embodying the role of a tour guide, feeling the confidence and excitement that comes with sharing your passion for this land.
Exactly. And by visualizing yourself in that role, you're not just preparing for the exam, you're preparing for the incredible journey that lies ahead.
I love that. It's about seeing yourself not just as a student, but as a future tour guide, ready to embark on this amazing adventure.
And speaking of adventures, I think it's time to move on to the notes discussion of the challenges and rewards that come with being an Israeli tour guide.
Yeah, let's dive into that. All right, so we're back, and we've been talking all about this Israeli tour guide exam, getting ready for it, what to expect.
Yeah, it's a lot to cover.
It is. We've covered a lot of ground from navigating those clashing historical perspectives to unearthing those needles in the haystack exam details, and even talked about incorporating technology into these historical sites.
And of course, the importance of visualizing yourself, not just passing the exam, but actually thriving as a tour guide, sharing your knowledge and passion with everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways? What's the big picture message you want our listener to walk away with?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that preparing for this exam, it's not just about memorization. It's about really deeply understanding this land, its history, its people.
It's like you become a detective, piecing together this puzzle of Israeli history and culture.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that the exam is just a stepping stone. The real journey begins when you actually step into the role of a tour guide. Bringing that knowledge to life, connecting with people, sharing your own perspective.
That brings us to the final thought-provoking question from the notes. If you could design the ideal tour guide curriculum, what would it include? What would you prioritize to make sure that your students not only passed the exam, but also became really engaging, insightful storytellers?
That's a great question. For me, it would be about finding a balance between the academic side and the practical experience. Yes, historical facts and dates are important, but it's equally important to be able to weave those facts into a compelling narrative, a story that people can connect with on an emotional level.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's about bringing history to life, making it relevant to a modern audience. So how would you actually incorporate that into the curriculum?
Well, I would encourage students to immerse themselves in the culture, talk to locals, explore beyond those typical tourist sites. I'd also emphasize storytelling, developing their own personal voice and finding creative ways to engage their audience.
I love that. It's about going beyond the textbook, experiencing the land and its people firsthand, and finding your own way to share that experience with others. It's a challenge, but wow, incredibly rewarding.
Absolutely. And remember, you don't have to wait until you're a certified guide to start practicing. You can start right now. As you're studying, as you're taking tours, challenge yourself to think like a storyteller. What details jump out at you? What stories resonate? How would you share those with someone who's never been to Israel?
That's great advice. So to our listener who's embarking on this journey to become an Israeli tour guide, we say this: embrace the challenge. Immerse yourself in the experience. Never stop exploring. We're here to support you every step of the way.
We believe in you. Your passion, your desire to learn and share your knowledge, that's what's going to make you a truly exceptional guide.
So go out there, soak up the knowledge, hone your storytelling skills, and get ready to share your love of Israel with the world. We can't wait to see what amazing stories you'll tell. Until next time, happy trails.